I will now pass you over to everyone. We'll give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
Want me to say something? Oh yes, and as we've said, this is being recorded tonight, so it's an audio recording of the podcast. We may do a scan of the audience, as Chris over there might do a scan of the audience.
Visual.
Quick visual, so just let you know that if there's any issues, just let us know. Okay,
So if any of you are wanted by the FBI, go now.
Or put your mask on. Thank you, Sarah. And while you're here, because I'll probably forget at the end, I just want to thank you and Glasgow Life, but you especially, for all the work that you've done to put this together. And I know that you've got a new job and you're now doing both jobs and only getting paid for one. So thanks for everything you've done for us. Thanks very much. Oh, that was a great night. I enjoyed that.
It's great.
I'm standing up because I still can. So if Tom says need it, you know what's going on. The second thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. Thanks very much for making your way here. I know how tricky it is to get here at this time of night on a Thursday night in Glasgow, but the library closes at 8. So we were restricted with the times. We would normally have these things a wee bit later. And 2 weeks tonight, we've got an event in the Three Crows in the West End of Glasgow, up at Jordan Hill, and it starts at 8 o'clock. And it's licensed as well, so that'll be a different scenario altogether. So somebody asked me if it's going to be the same show there. The chances of that are nil, because we won't remember what we said tonight. So there's no chance of that happening. Let me introduce myself, Simon McLean. That's my book there, The 10%. I was a police officer here in Strathclyde with the real police in Glasgow, and served initially down in Campbelltown in Argyll. Went into CID down there, was in Rothesay for my sins on the Isle of Bute for a couple of years, and then came to Glasgow to the Serious Crime Squad, and thereafter started working with National Crime Intelligence and surveillance and stuff like that, undercover work. So that's a wee bit of my background. See, before I go any further, can I just do a wee bit of research for our purposes? Who here is a listener to Crime Time Inc? One. Thanks, Andy. My pal, my dad. Has anybody not heard that at all? That's shocking. So that's interesting, because it means I need to do more of an introduction about Crime Time Inc. than we were planning to do. Because there's a wee card on your chair, and that's our podcast. Okay, we're into episode series 3 just now, which is just coming to an end. We've got almost 200 episodes on there. Is that right, Chris? How many episodes have we got on the Crime Time Inc?
200.
Yeah. So it's been going for over a year now. We're just about to finish season 3 and have a special about Charles Manson that Chris has put together. And then we've got a new season altogether, season 4 all lined up. We're also doing some work with Small Town Dicks, an American podcast, and Tom's got a lot of episodes on there with them as well. So we really need to start from scratch here with this audience, Tom. Let me firstly introduce Tom Wood to you, former Deputy Chief Constable of Lothian and Borders Police, and I'll let Tom introduce himself and bring Jane.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much, and it's great to be here in the Mitchell, because we're going to be talking about the Madeleine Smith case and the Oscar Slater case, and it's fantastic to think that there are documents here which relate to these crimes, these notorious crimes, and so I think we're going to get a wee chance to have a look at some of them.
At 7 o'clock, we'll have exhibits through there in that room there that you'll be able
this is not just a library, but it's also a museum, so I'm delighted to be here. And I was just saying to this gentleman here that one day I'm going to come through here and there's going to be no roadworks at Charing Cross. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Whether I live to see it or not. My name is Tom Wood. I was a policeman around about the same time as Simon. I was through in Edinburgh, mainly in the CID, mainly in serious crime. Latterly, I was the Deputy Chief Constable and Director of Operations for the Force. I was involved in leading the World's End murder case, which we'll refer to later on. There's a book up there about it. You'll see a poster. Before that, or before I wrote that book, I also wrote a book about the Roxton murders, which are probably one of the most consequential murders of the 20th century because of what that case did to establish forensic science. And my new book, coming out in the 1st of May, is The Bombing of Edinburgh and Leith. I'm involved in the Historical Society through there. In fact, I am a historical artifact, as Simon will quickly tell you. But so we uncovered rare photographs, genuine photographs, crime scene photographs of all the bombing raids of Edinburgh, at least during the Second World War. There were a lot more than people realise. And so we're bringing out a book which will be out on the 1st of May, fabulous black and white crime scene standard photographs and text, to coincide, of course, with the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. So that's the next project. But I've really enjoyed it. I mean, we've been doing this now. How long?
A year.
Chris, how long have we been doing the podcast?
September 2004, we launched the first one.
And there's no time off for good behaviour. But I've really enjoyed it. And we've covered tremendous ground of historical cases, cases we've been involved in, cases Simon says he's been involved in, which is not the same thing. So it's been a real roller coaster. And all the time we've been accompanied and supported by Jane Hamilton. Now, Jane and I go back a long, long way. Not always on the friendliest of terms, because Jane was the doyen of crime reporters through in the east of Scotland, and in fact through in Glasgow. She worked for the Daily Record, she worked for the Sunday Mail. So she really was, for many, many years, the crime reporter. And Jane was always my friend, but when I got a phone call from her, I was like, Jane, what has she found out now? Oh. However, since we've both retired from the front line, we've actually become a lot more friendly. There's not that tension anymore.
You've just aged me by 20 years.
What, sorry?
You've just aged me by 20 years.
Oh, well, sorry.
Semi-retired.
Listen, she was a child reporter. She was 6 when she was a crime reporter. Well, looking forward tonight, we're going to talk about some cases we've been involved in. We're going to talk about some books. Jane's just got a very good book, an interesting book coming out very shortly about the murder of Mary McLaughlin. And we're going to talk about that too. We're going to describe that case. And I want to say a few words too about the forensic science implications of that case. And then I hope we can have questions. And if we don't know the answers, we'll make them up. Okay? Jane.
There you go.
Who's starting? Me.
Yes.
So how many are aware of the Mary McLaughlin murder in 1984? So it's quite, I believe that it was unsolved for 35 years for people that don't know. Mary McLaughlin was a mother of 11 and she was murdered in her own home in 1984. And her murder was unsolved for 35 years. And it was, as Tom said, you know, the forensics played a massive part in the discovering who her killer was. I've got a book out in July in conjunction with Mary's daughter, Gina, and she wanted to tell her story. Gina spent 35 years trying to figure out who had murdered her mum. And it's a really grim, heartbreaking story. And it's not just about how it's affected Gina, but how it affected her family and how it affected the local community in Partick. Mary was a very well-known character. She was a happy wee soul. She was well-known in the pubs round about the area in Partick. And she had a routine. And the police at the time, and I'm sure the guys will tell me, in 1984, it was very, very easy to get away with murder. We didn't have the forensics that we've got now.
It was in Glasgow.
Especially in Glasgow. And, you know, in the 70s and the 80s, and Tom knows more about this than I do because I was just a baby, but it was a dangerous time to be a woman. And there we had a lot of, given that we're a small country, we had a lot of murders. Glasgow was known as the murder capital of the UK, in fact, of the world. At one point, we had more murders in Mexico, which, you know, given their drug problem, seems a bit off the scale. So it was easy to get away with murder because all that the police had at their disposal at that time was probably just fingerprints. DNA was just in its infancy in 84, very, very much in its, they could do blood typing, I believe, in 1984, but if the police didn't have anything to go on at the crime scene. Other, there was,
Yeah.
they didn't know. However, we're going to talk about the forensics in Mary's case because what Mary was wearing that night became very important and crucial in solving her murder.
Okay, I'd just like a few words about that. First of all, the first murder investigation in 1984, Simon was actually on that squad. Okay. Now, we didn't like to talk about it much, but he actually was on that squad.
I know I don't look old enough, but yeah, I was, yeah.
But actually, what that 1984 squad did, they maybe didn't solve the murders, but what they did right was that they took and they preserved the forensic evidence properly and retained it properly. That was not always done at that time, but credit to the 84 team that they did it properly. Now, when you read or you hear about the wonders of new forensic science and DNA and solving crimes 40 and 50 years ago, always remember that modern science stands on the shoulders of the original crime scene investigators. Because if they didn't do the job properly, no modern science, nothing that Elon Musk can even imagine is going to help you, right? Because you need to have the materials right. Mary McGlaughlin is significant because what happened was it was unsolved in 84. In 2014, when Police Scotland came about, a guy called Ian Livingston, who we both know, I worked with Ian and Jane knows him, who was Deputy Chief Constable of Police Scotland in charge of crime, ordered a forensic review of all cold cases. Okay, so everything that was in fridges and freezers was taken out and was subjected to new 21st century examination. And one of the things that came out of the freezer was the dressing gown belt that Mary McGlaughlin had been used as a ligature for Mary. And I brought, this is not the dressing gown belt, but I brought the dressing belt just as a demonstration. Now, what we were doing then is we were looking at low copy number DNA. Low copy number DNA is not like body fluids, and it's the DNA that comes from skin follicles as you touch someone or as you handle something. Now, as I'm standing here, rough articles like this and rough texture is actually better than something smooth. As I'm standing here holding this in my hand, I'm not leaving many traces on this belt. It's only if I grip it tightly that I'm leaving traces on the belt. Now, in the World's End case, which had just come to trial in 2014, World's End, there's a book up there I've written about it. That was crucial because there was a ligature used in the murder of these girls in 1977 with a sealed knot which contained DNA. And we proved in the 2014 trial of Angus Sinclair that the DNA could only have been there by somebody stretching and somebody pulling, in other words, the forcible contact with an article like this. It couldn't have been done just by touching. That was a landmark piece of forensic science. And in the Mary McGlaughlin case, they did exactly the same. There was a knotted ligature, and inside the knot was sealed the DNA profile of the man involved.
I should just say it
Now-
took the forensic scientist quite a long time to untie the knot
Absolutely.
because they didn't want to destroy any potential evidence that might have been inside.
Now, just as an example, I'm going to show you how it works. I'm going to triangle Simon McLean.
Sacrificial lamb. Now I know why I'm here.
No, but the point is that these two cases, first the World's End and then Mary McGlaughlin, established not just the DNA issue, but the interpretation of the DNA. Not just that it's there, but how it got there. This business about the forcible tying of the knots. So both these cases were hugely significant. And of course, in the case of the Mary McGlaughlin case, it was absolutely a clincher.
Yeah, they also got DNA from cigarette butt. again, in 1984, it's incredible that the police, the crime scene officers at the time, had the presence of mind to preserve those items. I mean, we can talk about other cases in Glasgow where the productions from, 3 women that were murdered in 1977, the Bible John murders, there are no productions from any of those cases anymore because then over the years they were stored incorrectly and they were lost. So it's a testament to the original police officers in 1984 that they had the presence of mind to store these items because in the future it might be important. And that's, a good thing that, they were able to think like that.
Can I ask you a question? I wasn't involved in the Mary McLaughlin case. You've written about it and you were involved in the initial
It was Paisley.
investigation. So the culprit for Mary McLaughlin was a man from Edinburgh.
You might have known.
Yeah, we have a man from Edinburgh who was out on licence from prison just for the weekend. And he found his way through here. And where was the actual locus? of the-
Paisley.
Say-
Paisley.
Paisley.
Yep. West
To
End.
Paisley.
Partick.
Paisley. Okay.
I've always thought. She wrote the book.
I know.
You were only on the squad.
I'm not buying that book, I'll tell you
You're
that.
going senile.
There must have been a local connection. How did he find his way through here from Edinburgh with no connections at all to the West? How there had to be a connection.
We don't know much about him. The murderer, Graham McGill, has never given a reason or a motive for targeting Mary that night, other than the police supposition is that she was a lone female. She might have had a little drink in her. She'd stopped for chips on the way home from the pub. She was in a pub that was known as the Hindland Bar, which is, I believe is now called the Duck Club. So people from Glasgow might be aware of it. She was known, she was in that pub most nights playing dominoes, having a drink with her pals. She was out quite a lot with one of her daughters. And she made her way home on her own, walking along a busy road. She was seen by quite a lot of witnesses. Her shoes were in her hand. She was walking in her
Jane,
bare
you
feet.
don't want to give away the whole book here.
I don't want to give away the whole book. But anyway, the killer has never ever given a reason why he targeted Mary, and the police believe it's because she was an easy target. She was a lone female.
Just a thought there, and this is what happens on the podcast as well. It's never rehearsed, just like this, because we go with the flow. We go with the flow to our train of thought. And I'm just thinking as you're talking there, Jane, that the likelihood, this is something that happens all the time in prison and even in police stations when people are incarcerated, they talk. We can't keep them apart. They're talking all the time. And what they're doing is exchanging information about potential victims, break-ins, frauds, anything in the criminal world that they can exchange and boast about sometimes, which the police rely on greatly often. But that could well be that he heard someone in the prison said, there's an old woman lives at such and such that he delivered a paper to, or whatever the connection might be. You could never uncover that because the criminals are exchanging information all the time.
It just seems very odd, though. In 1984, transport links were not like what they are nowadays. And
Much better.
it would take, he was on the last 2 days of his leave. Why would you travel all the way through from Edinburgh to Glasgow? And Partick is so specific.
You know, there had to be
A connection.
a connection. He had to be coming through to see someone. To me, that's the link that's missing.
Yeah.
And to me, that was the only possibility of getting onto this guy. The funny thing was, when this guy McGill was identified by the DNA in the knots as I've described, it was found that he was in prison. And so there was very real thoughts about, well, the DNA must be wrong with it. No, well, it's not. It's a very, very full profile. It can't be wrong. And then when they looked at the records very carefully, they found he was actually on weekend leave. And that's one thing you learn when you're investigating a serious crime. When you come up with someone and say, oh, he was in prison at the time, check and double check. Because quite often they're on day release or training for freedom or something. There's a whole lot of people that on the face of it are in prison that actually are not.
Yeah, for sure.
And that was the case with McGill, wasn't it?
Yep. What I'd like to do, considering that we've got an audience here that are not Crime Time Inc. listeners, because we can take a bit for granted because we've got 200 episodes out there. So we expect that people know Tom and I, and Jane's been on a few episodes as well. Just to recap for you a wee bit about how this came about, because podcasts are quite new, and Tom and I would probably never have got into it without Chris's input, because he does all the technical stuff behind the scenes, all the easy stuff, the editing, producing, and everything. So the reason for it is that Tom and I get asked all the time. I'm a campaigner for drugs, to change the laws regarding drugs, to get rid of prohibition. I've got my book. Tom's got several books. I just did one book and that was everything done. Tom's still trying to get the right one, doing books all the time. And we were getting media attention, the media talking to us. Tom's never off the BBC. You probably saw him last week talking about Tobin, which we'll come back to in a minute or two, because Jane was involved in that too. But the point I want to make to you is that when you see someone like Tom or I, or a policeman or whatever on the media, what you see is the edited version of what they were trying to say. And I've been out and done 2-hour sessions, and then it's a 3-minute clip that comes out of that. And it's not the 3-minute clip that I would have picked, ever. Would you agree with that, Tom? That's how we came about to do this, so that we can discuss things in full.
Yeah.
We can explore them as we do it and bounce them off each other, bring guests in that can add a different viewpoint, and get feedback from the audience about what you guys want to know about these things. Because there's nobody better placed when it comes to forensics than Tom to talk about. And we'll talk about in fact, I'll do that right now, because that kind of puts everything into perspective. Tom wrote a book called Ruxton, the First Modern Murder. Does anybody know who Ruxton was? One or two hands? No?
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, Nick, because now it feels that everybody should know, doesn't it, Tom? And Tom's book, the First Modern Murder, describes that from 1935, when Ruxton was convicted and executed for the murders. I'll let Tom explain how that set the scene for all forensic examination now, and across the world, across the globe. It was a groundbreaking case. Tom's book is fascinating. If you could give us a quick 2 or 3 minute summary of that, Tom.
Absolutely. If you've attended detective training or you've been at a forensic science course of any shape or description, you will know about the Ruxton case, or you think you will know about the Ruxton case. And I had done that. I'd studied at university, I'd been on detective training, and about 2000, I was given a big bundle of old papers that had been handed in by the family of a long dead policeman that found it in the attic of his house. They handed it in, and I flipped through these papers, old, foolscap type statements, and they were relating to the Ruxton case. And I thought, well, I know all about the Ruxton case, so I'll just close this and I'll put it away and I'll look at it another day. And it was years later, when I was clearing out that drawer to go and move somewhere else in the office, that I actually took time to read them, and I realised that I didn't know all about the Ruxton case, and that the history that had been written up to that time was in actual fact partial. And I think this is number one lesson. If you're researching anything, history is usually partial and incomplete. And this is particularly true of true crime history.
Yeah.
So anyway, in a nutshell, I looked at all these statements. They were fantastic because they were first-hand accounts of people who were there. They told a completely different story. They introduced a completely new cast of characters, not least one Percy Sillitoe, whose name you might know, a great chief constable of Glasgow, probably the only decent policeman that Glasgow's produced. And so it went on. But the point was this: the legacy of that case was the creation of the modern science-led criminal investigation that we have today, and that I was brought up with, and that Simon and I worked with. I have no idea that actually the Ruxton case was the foundation stone to all of that. And that's why the book is called The First Modern Murder. And it was turned into a 6-part podcast by Small Town Dicks, American company. And the book has done very well. And hopefully, Small Town are also going to turn it into a drama documentary television film coming soon. So it's a great story, but at its heart, it's about a change. And it changed from very 19th century, where forensic science was the icing on the cake and that one or two people dabbled in it and the Metropolitan Police really were the only people doing it, to forensic science being mainstream and part of an important critical part of modern criminal investigation, which we were brought up. So that's how important the case was.
And we have done a six-parter on the Ruxton as well. It's part of the Crime Time Inc. Back catalogue, if you like, those 200 episodes. What's very interesting here is we mentioned Tobin there, Peter Tobin. And I know it's not scripted, we hadn't spoke about it, but it's important because Jane had an important role in that inquiry as well. And everybody in here will know the name Peter Tobin because his last murder was committed not half a mile from here. The interesting thing there is that Ruxton case that laid the foundations of, it really made people start taking crime scenes seriously and managing them properly, as you've alluded to, that the cops did in some cases in the 80s and so on, and preserving that evidence and looking at how we could develop that. And that's what, even fingerprints from the Ruxton case, all sorts of new technologies, if you like, forensic technologies, came from that case. And Peter Tobin is a prime example. He was caught for the murder not far from here, but without those forensics, without the preservation and the inquiry that went on thereafter, he wouldn't have been snared for the other two murders that he was snared for. So I'm going to let Jane tell you a wee bit about that, because the officer in charge of that inquiry was a Davy Swindle, who was tasked with looking back at Tobin and looking back at his history. But Jane had a part in pointing him in that direction, because you were there from day one when Cluck, the girl Cluck, was found in the church, Jane, is that right?
So I was working at the Sunday Mail at the time, and we got a tip-off that there was a lot of police activity at St Patrick's Church, which was just up the road from our office down at Central Quay. So I was sent up with a photographer to try and find out what was going on. And of course, as a journalist, you know, you're hitting the phone at that point. You know, you're trying to find out from contacts what's happening. So you're phoning everybody that might know something that's going on. By the time the photographer and I got up to the church, I was told that there was a body under the floorboards. And of course, when we got to the scene, cops at the scene weren't too chuffed to see us all pitching up, because obviously they've got a job to do, but we've got a job to do as well. And that inform the public about what's going on. And this is pre the days of social media and Facebook and, you know, things blowing up on social media. So public were relying on newspapers, radio, television for their news. It took us a couple of days for the police to tell us that it was a young woman who was volunteering at the church, Angelica Clute, and that we found out that one of the handymen had gone missing, and he was known as Pat McGlaughlin. So I worked on it, we broke the story, and then over a course of a couple of months, I was tasked with investigating who Pat McGlaughlin was. And by that point, by the Tuesday, I think that was on the Saturday, and by the Tuesday, we knew that Pat McGlaughlin was an alias for Peter Tobin. And I was tasked with finding out who is Peter Tobin and what's happened, where's he come from, how does an elderly gentleman suddenly become a murderer in a church of all places. And so I spent a good part of a year, and we weren't allowed to report on anything in there. When Peter Tobin was arrested, Scots law prohibits us from reporting on anything other than giving his name and his age, what he's been charged with. And then it all goes quiet. If you wonder why when you hear about big murders in the media and then it seems to disappear from the face of the earth, that's why we're not allowed to report on anything until the trial starts. And then it only has to be the court proceedings, and then afterward we can say what we've uncovered about them. And so during that quiet year, when everybody thought that the Angelica Clute murder had been forgotten, I was investigating Peter Tobin. And it took me to Poland, it took me to down to Sussex. I interviewed his wife, his son, his other ex-wife, his first ex-wife. And what I uncovered helped the police to set up Anagram, and David Swindle has quite often said that it was the work of journalist me that helped them realise that Peter Tobin was perhaps not a one-time killer, and that this was perhaps a serial killer that they were looking at. So yeah, that was my involvement with Peter Tobin.
Thanks
But
for
just to
doing-
explain that Operation Anagram was the operation to the, you see, so here you have Peter Tobin responsible for this horrendous murder of Angelica Klug. And so the question then is, well, what else has he done? Where else has he been? And Operation Anagram is when you try and fill in every week and every day and every month of his life up until that time, when he's not been in prison or when he's not been somewhere you can account for it. Now, we did that with Angus Sinclair in the World's End murders, exactly the same process. It was a lot harder with Peter Tobin because he changed his name and he was a traveller. He was flitted about the country. Just one more thing, just about Peter Tobin was, Angelica Klug, his last murder, was a big mistake because Peter Tobin always kept control of the deceased remains of his victims. That was his MO, that was his modus operandi. And the other two murders that he was convicted for, he'd actually kept the bodies, kept the remains, either in his immediate control or at somewhere where he knew. But in the case of Angelica Klug, I don't think he could do that. So it was a hurried concealment come burial under the floor of the church.
You might not, Tom might not remember this, but I started my career as a crime reporter at the Edinburgh Evening News, and I was just a young reporter, and I was trying to, make my mark with the newspaper.
When you were 6.
And I remember
When you were
phoning
6, yeah.
when I was 6. I remember calling Tom up one day and saying the editor wants a series of unsolved murders, and you suggested Vicky Hamilton, who was Peter Tobin, one of Peter Tobin's earlier victims. And I had no idea back then in 2001, that Peter Tobin that was actually the start of, my career with Peter Tobin,
Yep.
trailing it.
And just to tidy that up, Vicky Hamilton went missing on 1991, the 10th of February, and you were involved in that because it was Lanarkshire bordering Lothian and Borders.
I was the divisional commander at West Lothian, and on the 10th of February 1991, I was called out for a missing person, a vulnerable missing person from Bathgate in West Lothian. And it was the coldest night of the year. It was bitterly cold. There was snow on the ground. It was absolutely freezing. And Vicky, a wee girl, had come from visiting friends, relatives in Livingston, and was making her way back to Falkirk. And the bus, she had to get off in Bathgate and wait for another connecting bus. And she was last seen standing at a bus stop right opposite the police station in the main street at Bathgate, if any of you know. And I was called out that night, vulnerable missing person, bitterly cold, of course, so we had to arrange searches to see whether she'd maybe gone into a closer or something to cuddle down to keep warm or something like that, because the bus was delayed, because the snow on the road was terrible, the vehicles couldn't get down. But once we had searched and we found that she wasn't anywhere locally, we knew that something had befallen her, because she wasn't the kind of lassie to wander off, just a young girl. And in that night, there was no good outcome to that. There was no natural outcome to that. She couldn't have wandered away. There was very few vehicles on the road because of the snow. So we didn't think she'd been uplifted either. We thought she was in a house nearby somewhere. And very shortly after, we started what we called a bullseye search. So we started where she was last seen and worked out with, as you do with a bullseye. Now, what we didn't know until much later, until Angelica Klug, that actually Peter Tobin lived in a house not too far away. And as we started to search out near him, he fled the scene, and we found out later, took the dismembered body parts of Vicky with him. So that was my first introduction to Vicky Hamilton. But Vicky Hamilton, sometimes, and Simon will identify with this, and Jane too, sometimes you come across cases in your career that just stick with you. There's just something not right with them, and you keep remembering them. And that was the reason, Jane, when you phoned me up and said, what should I do about it? And also I said to you, recommended to you, do Vicky Hamilton, because there was unanswered questions there. And we searched, and in the springtime when the snow went away, we searched miles outside Bathgate, but there was no chance, I didn't think, of finding her, because it had been so cold and snowy that night that nobody could have moved a body. A car even couldn't have moved a body out. It had to be close at hand. And as it turned out, it was very close at hand.
What we should do for completeness there is that we've mentioned Angeline Cluke and we've mentioned Vicky Hamilton. His third victim was Dinah McNichol, who disappeared on the 5th of August 1991 from a music festival down south. And her body was found along with Vicky Hamilton's body, buried in his garden in Margate. So that kind of brings Tobin, and there's 2 murders in 1 year, and then the Cluke murder 10 years later. And there's nobody I've ever met who thinks that was all that Tobin ever did. But one of the things these people do that I find is really unforgivable, apart from everything else, is they take these secrets to the grave with them. They're very reluctant to ever cooperate with us. And they have no empathy. That's the reason for that, obviously. For completeness there, because I mentioned Bible John, I slipped him in there. And I know that Tom, this is where we might get, that's why I'm sitting in the middle, because we might get some friction here between the press inventing Bible John and between the police in Tom's view that you'll hear in a minute or two. Because the reason I'm mentioning it is because Tobin, a lot of people say, oh, Tobin could have been Bible John. And Tom will explain why that's just not feasible.
Well, put it this way, it's very sloppy thinking. Well, and it's all the time. You get someone like Tobin, or someone like Angus Sinclair, or someone like Robert Black, who killed Vicky Hamilton, who killed Caroline Hogg and Susan Maxwell. And you think, oh, he's a serial killer, and therefore he must have killed this one, that one, the next thing. You know, it's adding 2 and 2 and coming to 15. It's nonsense. You've got to look at these cases individually, because there's no evidence at all to link Peter Tobin with the so-called Bible John murders. Now, let's talk about that for just a second. And I don't think Jane and I are actually out of sync on this too much. The Bible John murders were three series of 3 murders, which attracted enormous publicity. And a very helpful senior reporter with the Daily Record, I think, coined the nickname Bible John. It wasn't Jane, it was long before Jane's thing. Bible John. And created this mythical serial killer that thereafter everybody was looking for. I don't think there ever was a Bible John, and I don't think the 3 murders were committed by the same person. I think 2 were, and I think the other was not, because they're quite different in terms of the pattern, and they're quite different in terms of the profile of the offender. However, what it did do was actually set the police, and a very, very fine detective called Joe Beattie, who I knew later as a retired officer. I knew him as an older man, a very fine detective, and head of Glasgow CID, Strathclyde CID at that time. He became fixated, obsessed. It ruined his health, actually, with this hunt for Bible John, someone who did not exist. And the ghost of Bible John haunted us as we were looking for the World's End murderers, as we were looking for the other serial killers of the 1970s, 80s, particularly Robert Black, because what we couldn't afford to do is have a fictional bogeyman and lead us off down the wrong path. So Bible John did not exist in my view, but is hugely important in terms of how we managed and still manage major crime.
Operation Anagram, when it was looking at Peter Tobin, took, as Tom did during Operation Trinity when he was looking at Angus Sinclair, they looked at every unsolved murder of a female in Scotland. And it was a massive task. Tom will tell you more about that. But in terms of Anagram, they looked at every unsolved murder in Scotland to try and ascertain if Peter Tobin could have been responsible. And the Bible John was included in that. Now, I was fortunate enough to have a very long-standing friendship with the widower of one of the last so-called Bible John victims until we were friends until he died 2 years ago. And he never believed that Bible John existed either. In his later years, George believed that his wife was a victim of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, which was definitely not a possibility. But it was ascertained during Anagram that when Helen Puttock, the last victim, was murdered, Peter Tobin was actually on his honeymoon with his second wife and therefore couldn't be Bible John. But that myth still exists out there that Bible John is Peter Tobin because of the photo fit picture. But if you look at the original photo fit picture of Bible John, he's dark-haired, brown-eyed, and then we get the famous picture that was done by the artist, and all of a sudden he's blonde-haired, blue-eyed. So the two, there was that discrepancy, and there was a lot. The guys will speak more about the police investigation than I can, but there was a lot of confusion and panic about at the time, and you had two different pictures circulating of who Bible John might be. But I can categorically state that it was not Peter Tobin.
Yeah. Well enough, I had an old CID boss who used to talk about artist's impressions as being a perfect likeness of someone who doesn't exist. Very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
Because people thereafter are not looking for, they're looking for this person.
Yeah.
I have to say though.
And it creates so much work.
Oh yeah.
Because everyone looks like loads of people, and we get the same people phoning in all the time, and it clogs up the phones, it clogs up the inquiry, because you have to follow them all through. And obviously 100% of them in this case were wrong, but it's usually 99.9.
Well, I mean, I have a colleague in Strathclyde, a senior detective, who is firmly of the view that a suspect who came into the frame later, a man called McInnes, who's now long dead, committed suicide 6 months after the last of the Bible John 3 or the Bible John 2, as I would refer them. That in actual fact, there was an incomplete DNA match, but that was incomplete back then. Remember that DNA has developed so much since. He still thinks, and he was involved in the investigation, and I take his word for it, that I do think that McInnes was involved in some of the murders.
What I'd like to do, I want you all to bear this in mind, that what you're getting here in an hour is what 200 episodes is a couple of 100 hours that we've got on the podcast on Crime Time Inc. when we go into these cases in great detail. For example, Bible John, I think we've done 2 or 3 episodes specifically on so-called Bible John. Robert Black, he threw into the equation there just as one of our worst ever serial killers that you'd all be aware of over on the East Coast. Horrible cases. And Tom again was involved in that inquiry to hunt him down and snare him eventually. So we're just getting a wee bit of recorded highlights here. I think that's the best way to describe what you're getting here from us, to point you in the right direction, because the purpose of the podcast is to explain these things in much greater detail. And thanks to Chris, we've got ways of communicating. You can go on the website, you can leave a voice message, you can write a message, ask a question. We're always looking for that feedback, and to people come up with new aspects all the time, new perspectives all the time. And Tom did the Edinburgh case, where the prostitute was murdered, where it's still unsolved. And he's anxious to solve it. It's one of them that sticks, isn't it?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Because it's solvable, that's the point.
Yes.
It's solvable. There's forensic evidence there. It can be done.
Yeah.
It's just a case of keeping pushing and pushing and pushing and asking other questions and knocking on other doors. And it will be solved. But it will not be solved if we just forget about it.
Yeah.
And it deserves, going back to a point Jane made, I think it was early on, very important point. We always, I don't know why, we take a perverse pleasure from thinking that we live in the most violent of times. I mean, I'm not talking about internationally now. I'm talking about nationally, how things have never been more dangerous on the streets. Well, I can tell you that statistically, there's no question that the 10-year period between the mid-70s and the mid-80s was the most violent decade in the history of Scotland, particularly for women victims. if you look at, first, for a start, uniquely, we had 3 predatory, sexually motivated murderers on the streets of Scotland at that time. We had Tobin, we had Robert Black, and we had Angus Sinclair. Now, the probability of that in such a small country as we are is almost negligible. In fact, when I spoke to the FBI behavioral sciences people about it, they said, there's got to be a connection, because statistically, it can't be. You've only got a conurbation of about 1 million people. To have these 3 men all operating around about the same time, predating on girls and young women, sexually motivated, all of them, there's got to be a connection. And there wasn't. There wasn't. We turned over everything to find out whether there was any connection between these 3. But they weren't the only ones. When we did the Scottish Homicide Database, remarkably, when we were doing Operation Trinity into the World's End murders, we found out that there was actually no record existing of how many women had been killed in Scotland. You know, wait a minute, it's got to be somewhere, statistics, the Crown Office, the government. Well, it wasn't. So we set about compiling the Scottish Homicide Database of all homicides of women over the period 1968, I think, because that's when Angus Sinclair got out of prison, to 2004. It was absolutely horrendous. There was about 1,200 women had been murdered in Scotland during that period. Most of them in a domestic setting, but some of them not. And when you saw that list, bloody hell, it was horrendous. And it wasn't a complete list, because we had a very haphazard way of dealing with missing persons at that time. Better now, but in these days, you'd see a mispair report for a 16-year-old girl missing from Edinburgh, and somebody's written in, may have gone to London with her boyfriend. Full stop. What?
Yeah.
There was no evidence of that. There was no proof of that. May have run away to with a circus. You know, nonsense, utter nonsense. And there was one very, very sadly, when we were investigating Angus Sinclair, a young man came to the police station we were working from out of Livingston, knocked on the door, wanted to see a detective. One of the detectives said, I know you're investigating the murders of these women. I wondered perhaps if my mother was one of them. I said, well, who was your mother? He gave a name. It didn't mean anything to us at all. And it transpired that this young woman, round about the time when Sinclair was on the rampage in the late 1970s, had gone out one night, leaving the wee boy in the care of the grandparent, and had never come home. And 9 months later, her skeletal remains were found in a patch of woodland somewhere in the Lanarkshire area, and had been written off with no suspicious circumstances. And there was one side of a piece of paper, one side of an A4 missing person report that we eventually tracked down. And that was it. Now, how many more of these were that we didn't know? And there was no tying up. Now we've got a missing person database that we didn't have then. And so I'm never convinced that we've got the
systems
complete
in
story.
place. Systems in place.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. Tom talks about it on the podcast all the time because it comes up regularly. He talks about good people and bad systems. And if you think about it in any walk of life, in any of your employment, that's a recipe for disaster. It doesn't matter how good the people are. If the systems and procedures aren't in place to do things properly, then it's all going to fall down. And that's the same throughout police work. And it works the other way too. If you've got good systems and people not working the systems properly, then you're going to get the same result. Again, that's another couple of episodes that we covered, Tom.
One of the great, I mean, forensic science has brought us so much in the last 50 years in our police service. Fantastic. Crime scene management was really developed during the Ruxton case, and that's still complete. But the one marvelous thing that's been brought to us in my time, and that's computerized admin systems, the home systems. Now, it doesn't get much credit because DNA gets all the headlines and forensic science, CSI and all of that stuff. But believe me, computerized admin systems have been an absolute revelation and have solved hundreds and hundreds of crimes. But because before that, we used the old card index system, writing things on these big carousels. And I got a real solid experience. I was down at Scotland Yard one day, and I met the guy who was in charge of the Black Museum, and he said, come and I'll show you something. And he showed me some of the original artifacts of Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel Ripper. And the card indexes were almost exactly the same as we were using almost 100 years later. Honestly, you could recognize, I mean, obviously there was difference, but you could recognize we were doing the same thing 100 years later, trying to catch people like Tobin, people like Sinclair, people like Robert Black, who were highly mobile, darting about the country, abducting strangers, and all the rest of it. The computerized system, Holmes, was a revelation. And as I say, it's one of the great landmarks in criminal investigation.
And kept us going for another few episodes as well. You see what I mean about the highlights, and all we're getting is to skip across them just now. You get a feel for what the podcast is all about from the things we're talking about. The final case I want to talk about is because we've got some artifacts next door for that the Mitchell Library have kindly put out for us in the wee rooms through there that you can see. And that's a case. Some of the cases, we've gone back to the 1600s with some of the cases, haven't we? Was it burning of witches and all sorts of things we've covered. But this one goes back as well to Victorian times. And it was the Madeleine Smith case, Tom. It was part of the Murder Mile. And we did an episode of this with a guest, Donnie McIntyre, a friend of mine, who is a West Ender, and he was very curious about the Murder Mile. Who's heard about the Murder Mile? Yeah. So you're familiar with it as Glaswegians. And this is one of the 4 cases that was part of the Murder Mile, so-called Murder Mile investigation. And this was Madeleine Smith. I'll just read some of the facts of Madeleine Smith because we are a wee bit pushed, and I want to get some feedback from our audience tonight as well. The victim was Marion Gilchrist. No, that's Oscar. We can't do Oscar anymore. We were going to do Oscar, but he's sacked. The victim was Pierre-Emile Langelier. That do? My French was a 32-year-old French clerk. And the suspect was Madeleine Smith, a 21-year-old upper-class woman. So I can see that you would be able to associate with that in here tonight. And the location round the corner. Madeleine had a secret love affair, exchanging passionate letters, but Madeleine's parents arranged for her to marry someone else. She tried to break it off with Langelier, but he threatened to expose the relationship, which in those days would be horrific because it would ruin her reputation, because she wasn't upper class, if you like.
She wasn't married either, remember?
No, they were going to marry her. But he fell ill and died, Langelier, so that's the end of the case, other than from arsenic poisoning. And the authorities discovered the letters from Madeleine leading to her arrest on the suspicion of poisoning him. And then we had the trial. This kind of brings us into last week's podcast, talking about the not proven verdict, Tom, as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, there was a blackmail twist too, because what happened was when Madeleine tried to dump the French boyfriend so she could marry the upper class guy, he tried to use the letters to blackmail her. She wanted the letters back. He wouldn't give her the letters. But what runs through this case, interesting, and you see it in a lot of Victorian cases, that's poisoning. Poisons were available regularly. You could go and buy arsenic from the local chemist. It was used for a number of purposes. And before the Poisons Act, or the most recent Poisons Act, you could buy these deadly poisons. And there's a lot of poisoning in the Victorian time. I think my own thought is Madeleine Smith was very, very lucky to get off with a not proven. She really was.
Yeah.
What's interesting about it, you talked about crime scene
You missed an
management.
important point, though. You need to tell them that it was said in court that even she still got a not proven, but she was found 2 weeks before buying poison.
Buying poison, yeah.
But still
arsenic.
got a
right.
not proven.
But they said that the chemist who she bought it said that they put dye in their arsenic for safety's sake. There was no dye apparent at post-mortem. Well, there wouldn't be. But from a crime scene point of view, it's interesting because the critical part of the evidence was the letters, these passionate letters. that Madeleine exchanged with the French boyfriend. And these letters are here in
Yes.
the library. But there was a foul up at the crime scene because the police found all these letters and envelopes and stuffed the letters into the envelopes indiscriminately. There were no dates on top of the letters, so the only dating came from the postmarks on the envelopes, some of which were indistinct, but some of which weren't. But of course, there was no correlation between the letter and the envelope. And so the trail of evidence was lost. And here we are again, back to first officer at the scene and what they do and how they make the difference between success and failure, which is really the story of the Ruxton case.
Yep, fantastic. So we touched on Madeleine Smith, the murder miles were another. We only did 2 of them. We'll still get the other 2 to do in future episodes. And hopefully we'll get Donnie in to do that as well. What I'd like to do now, because we are running towards the end here, guys, is to get some questions. If anybody's got any questions, any subject at all, bear in mind we've got a former Deputy Chief Constable here in Hitchcock. Yes, thanks.
Social media,
Uh-huh.
the whole effect it has on people's attitudes. You mentioned about Bible John in that picture. I was thinking of Sutcliffe, wasn't it? And the voice which obsessed that assistant.
Yeah,
Chief.
Wearside Jack.
Yeah.
And
So I'm thinking of social media and red herrings and false trails and following up. There was the case of a guy falsely accused of rape, and then they looked through all of his social medias. Where do you find the time for all of this?
That's a very good question. And we heard from the Chief Constable, from the Commissioner I met recently, that over 51% of crime now is online. And it's a feature of our show this year, and it's something we're going to look at in the next season, is how we can help people be aware of their online dangers. And because it's not going to go away now, it's not going to get any better. Before Tom, because he'll not keep going now until 7:30 on this topic, remember I said about the phone calls, the spurious phone calls that you get when you ask for the public's help? You need to be very, very careful with that. Nobody knows better than Tom because he was senior investigating officer in many murder cases. And it's the same with social media. It's like everything else in the police. It's a double-edged sword. It's fantastic to get the public cooperation and get the information flowing in, but that's got to be managed. The systems and the manpower that you've just referred to has got to be there to manage all that information, because throughout all that information might be the one thing that you needed, the name or the location or a card or a registration number or even a description. And it's what we used to try to do with that paper carousel, was to match all those things up. Before I finish, Tom, just to mention, in the 80s, the busiest, I mean, it was incredible, the crime that we had. I was in government at the time, and it was through the roof. It was over 1,000 crimes a month, which is phenomenal. And now it's less than half that. In fact, it's a third of that, like the latest figures. But we had 100 murders a year in Glasgow. We hit 100 murders a year in Strathclyde at that time.
I remember
Yeah.
that.
We were solving 98% of them. There was 1 or 2 getting through the net. So we were keeping up. But while all those murder inquiries were going on, lots of other policing gets neglected, because it's not an infinite resource that we have. Nobody knows that better than Tom. Tom, social media?
No, just want to say that one of the reasons why you don't see many policemen walking the beat now is not because the Chief Constable wouldn't like it. She would. I know she would. But they've all been drawn off to do the kind of jobs that you've just described. But coming to social media, I thank goodness the one that sticks in my mind as being absolute classic was that poor woman that fell into the water, fell into the river. Did you remember that? And there was an absolute social media firestorm round about that. All sorts of amateur detectives and ghouls and people coming searching and all sorts of cockamamie theories and suggestions that her husband had killed her and all. Remember that?
Yeah.
I count myself fortunate that I policed in a time where I only had to deal with Jane. But seriously, the point is you were dealing with a professional, from a professional. When you're dealing with social media, you're in the Wild West, and it is a nightmare. And it requires such active management and the police often get it wrong. I mean, look at the riots down the north of England. That could have been stopped easily by an explanation quickly about what happened and about who the culprit was, and more especially who the culprit was not. Yeah. But for some reason, the Crown Prosecution Service told the Chief Constable to be quiet and not say it. I don't know why the Chief Constable took instructions from them. I don't think I would have. But you saw what happened thereafter. But Jane, I mean,
It's really
it must be
difficult.
a minefield.
I was charged with contempt about 7 years ago, and the reason I was charged with contempt, along with the editor of the Daily Record, was that the Crown Office decided that I should have expected that the man whose picture we used in the paper was going to be charged by the police. And I should have known that he was going to be charged by the police. And our argument was that the charges were dropped, by the way. I've not got a criminal record, but
Yet.
The night is young.
you know, it was a sex offender who had tried to abduct a child, and I'd come into possession of a picture of him being huckled, for want of a better word, by the cops. The picture didn't show his face, but we used that picture because by that point, when we'd gone to print, he hadn't been charged. And the lawyer said, he's not been charged, it's fine. We got charged with contempt because they said we should have had an expectation that he was going to be charged, and we were in danger of wrecking any future criminal proceeding. It's a double-edged sword. You either run with the name, and people like me face criminal charges, or you don't run with the name and social media is going to take over, like in the case of England, where the suspect his name was widely known to everybody, except to people that could actually do it properly and do it legally, weren't allowed to do it. So it ran amok on social media, and you had the riots. And you know, it's a difficult one.
The whole business about artificial intelligence, you'll know, is moving so quickly. And in terms of law enforcement, it's as simple as this. Law enforcement has got to learn to manage artificial intelligence, or artificial intelligence will manage law enforcement. It is not there's no passive option. You got to get in there and actually control it and use it, or it will control you and it will overwhelm you.
Yep.
And you will start to get murders driven by media and driven by hype and driven by false, dichotomy, everything. And it's a nightmare. Really, really, it's a whole new world out there.
Any more questions? Andy?
Simon, what's the gist of the drug deaths in Glasgow? What was dropped last year,
Yeah.
first time on trial.
Yeah.
Do you think the safe consumption rooms for the drugs is helping that?
Yeah, for sure. It will. Yeah, and it'll feed through and it'll help. Hopefully, because it's very much a trial just now. Is everybody aware that we have a safe consumption room in Glasgow now? Let me ask you all a question. Do you think that the current drug laws are working? And we should hammer down on it. More arrests, more prosecutions, and more seizures of drugs. Is that the way to go? You think that's the way to go? That's funny, because I asked the Superintendents Association that last year, and they agreed with you that we're wasting our time. Somebody in the BBC referred to it as whack-a-mole. That all you're doing is moving the problem all the time. And I know that from the 80s when heroin first hit our streets, when Afghan heroin came into Scotland and caused the havoc that it did, that every time we shut something down and had our success, 2 or 3 were waiting to open up shop. And nothing's changed in those 50 years since. To answer your question, Andy, it can only help because it's not just a safe consumption room. It's not just a place that people can go and use drugs safely. And there's bad heroin going about the streets right now. There was a death the other day that was caused by that, because we've no idea what people are buying on the streets, because it's criminals that are running the show. But the safe consumption room is a place where you can get pointed in a different direction. The one in Copenhagen has got washing machines. It's got microwaves that you can make a hot pot noodle or whatever it might be. It's got people there that you can talk to and communicate with and maybe get some guidance to change your life, whether that be homelessness or whatever might be the underlying issues in your life. So yes, I think it has started to make an impact. It's early days, and hopefully that model can spread through to Edinburgh and elsewhere in the country. And more importantly, can change our attitude about enforcement and prohibition. That we're never going to arrest. The Assistant Chief Constable of Police Scotland said, we can't arrest our way out of this problem. We need compassion. We need to help the users. We need to help the people that need the help to get off drugs and make different life choices, not prosecute them and put them in prison. And only then can we smash the gangs, the organised crime that are behind it, by taking the market away from them. Thanks, Andy. Did I answer your question? Yeah. It's unusual, isn't it?
Very.
All right, guys. Any more?
Yes. In terms of historic or cold cases,
Yeah.
do you feel there should be a point where there should be a cut-off point that's it, or would there always be there available in case there is new evidence?
Yeah. I'm going to Sure. The question is whether we should cut off court cases at a certain point, sometime down the road, and say we're finished with that one and move on. Yeah, in a sense. I know Tom is not trying to answer because he's worked on court cases. When Tom retired, he still worked consultancy with the police and throughout the country, actually, working on court cases. So he's got first-hand experience. I'll let him tidy it up after Jane's obviously got something to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I specialised in cold cases and serial killers, and as I said earlier, I had a 20-odd year friendship with the widower of one of the Bible John victims, so-called Bible John victim. And I just want to say that, it's not cold cases to the families. It could have been yesterday. It's never, ever, ever cold for them. And, the pain doesn't go. And, they have to see a resolution. And I've seen it countless times where, elderly family members will pass away without ever knowing what's happened to their loved one. We had a famous case in Edinburgh with the disappearance of a woman named Suzanne Pillay, and her body's still never been found. The man responsible for her murders in prison, but her poor father went to his grave never knowing where his daughter is. So yeah, and I don't think, I think they should stay open for as long as feasibly, they should be looked at periodically and reviewed. And if science has moved on, then yep, whether that's 50 years, 60 years.
Tom's got a great theory about cold cases.
Well, yeah, I have. I mean, the only way, the best way to handle a cold case is to keep it warm, right? Continue the investigation, because and I've been in a situation where you call down to Newcastle, would you come and review this case? And you come in, and there's two scenarios. You come in and you meet a detective inspector who's got the files and talks you through it, and that's wonderful. The other scenario is you come in, there's two cardboard boxes standing there, and nothing's filed properly, it's just a jumble of papers. To answer your question, for all practical purposes, if the suspect is dead and 50 years has passed, then you're really wasting your time. However, Jane's right. I had an occasion to knock on a door to speak to a family about the death of their daughter 45 years before. And I was there to talk about a historical crime, but for them it had happened yesterday. Because there wasn't a day they didn't wake up and think about that, and there wasn't a night they didn't go to sleep thinking about that, and it was absolutely current, and that was a very humbling experience for me. It really was, because I realised, because but a victim of that kind of time, it trips down the generations and destroys families incredibly. People die of alcoholism, people commit suicide, people die of despair. And you can see this death that took place in the 1970s has imploded a family. So while there's a chance at closure, and sometimes I've done this, I've gone into a house and said, look, you're going to do it. With very good reason to believe, very good evidence that it was Freddie Smith who died 10 years ago in prison. And he said, well, thanks very much, that's great. At least now we know what happened and we can bring some kind of closure to it. And I hope nobody here has been in that situation. I have not, thankfully, been in that situation, been a victim of violent crime, but I've been close enough to it to know that we owe a duty to find the answer when we possibly can. It's an old trite thing to say there's no such thing as an unsolved case, but in Scotland, thankfully, that's true. And the Homicide Review Board, Police Scotland, what they do is every month, head CID, head of forensics, Crown Office, they sit down and they take all the historic cases and they pull them out and they say, what's changed? Has forensic science changed? Has there been any other information? And that's why you have seen the Rennie McCrae case solved for Inverness 45 years later. That's why you've seen the Aberdeen scientist case solved 43 years later. It's because they take the view, and this is the upside of Police Scotland, that you have facilities to do this kind of thing, where you have a homicide review board with cold case specialists who actually look, and things are continually reviewed and nothing's allowed to go cold. And I think that's great.
Thanks, Tom. We need to wrap it up there, guys, because we're running short time. But the reason for that 5 minutes early is because it's Claire Anderson, it's Claire Thompson that's gone to the job today of digging out some artefact to do with Madeleine Smith. We did want to do Oscar Slater as well, but we're on a wee bit short of time, so that'll bring you back next time. Maybe we'll do that in the Sea Cross.
Yeah.
Start with Oscar Slater.
Yeah.
There they are. So that's it.
Just one other thing to say, Simon, that we've got some of our books here.
Yeah.
They're a bargain price, and they will be signed by the author. So avail yourself if you would like. They're all riveting reads. And my books are about true crime, 100% factual. Simon's think Enid like Saunderson.
The truth, the whole truth, and something like the truth. That sums it up.
Well, at least that's right.
2 things on your seat. You've got a wee card.
Oh yeah, what's it called?
Please go on and have a wee listen, Chris. We should have 40 odd new
Yeah,
listeners.
just to say that Jane's got a lovely little book of short stories called Tell Me a Story, which is on Amazon. She's run out of hard copies, much to her chagrin. So there's none here, but that's also great because there's a whole lot of little short stories there actually related to some of the cases and some of the experiences for JHB.
And finally, Tom and I, thank you, Jane. Thanks for coming along
Thanks for
tonight.
having me.
Very good of you. Thank you. And thank you all. And we'll see you again.
Remember that.